Hi and welcome to this evening of Game Starter. I'm Johannes Glockenbring from the location initiative Gamecity Hamburg from the nice city of Hamburg. Welcome to our stream. Glad you made it. We're looking to 1.5 hours of a nice conversation about narrative design and 3 experts from various studios joining us who will tell us something about their jobs as narrative designers. Very much looking forward to that. I'll just make a quick introduction with a few points from our side. For those who don't know us, Gamecity Hamburg is funded by the city of Hamburg to promote the local games industry. We do a lot of programs like the prototype funding or our Games Lift incubator, where we help young teams develop their first games. And speaking of which, I've got a short event tip for you. Our 5 incubator teams that we supported this year will have their graduation ceremony on December 1. You can tune in live via YouTube and see 5 nice games developed in Hamburg and hear about how our network and funding system helped them to achieve that. But yeah, you find all of that on our website, gamecity-hamburg.de. But now I'll quickly go over to the actual topic of the evening, which is narrative design. This is the 14th installment of our Game Starter series already. We covered a lot of different jobs from the games industry. If you're interested, check out our website or our YouTube channel. We have them all online, covered a lot of different positions. Tonight it's going to be, as I already said, narrative design, and we'll have a short introduction of our 3 very interesting panelists. After that, we'll start the discussion rounds. And yeah, if you have your own questions, please let us know via the chat on our website or on YouTube. You can ask your question anytime in the chat. We have a colleague monitoring the chat and collecting questions, and we will ask them at the end of the discussion round. So please have a little bit of patience if we don't ask your question right away. We see them all and we try to ask them all to the panel at the end of the event. Yeah, at around 7 we start with that, with the questions from the audience, and at 7:30 we plan to have reached the end of the event. After that, you're very welcome to join our Discord server if you have any more questions. But now it's a pleasure for me to introduce the 3 people on our panel tonight. A lot of thank you to our 3 panelists, which are Lena Falkenhagen, who is narrative director at Paintbucket Games and also a professor for game design at the UE Germany here in Hamburg. And James Nicholls joining us from London. He is employed at Fishlabs, which is a Hamburg-based studio, and he is a narrative designer. And Tamer joining from Paris, where she works for Ubisoft Mobile Paris as a senior narrative designer. And yeah, that's the point where we start right away. I'd like to switch over to let our panel introduce themselves and let them speak for themselves about their careers. Yeah, so welcome to all of you again. It's great that you could join us, and great that you share your knowledge and your experiences from your jobs. First thing I would like to know is, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where exactly do you work? Well, I said that already, but maybe you can tell us again with a little bit more detail. Where do you work and what's your job there? How long have you been in the industry, and how did you get there in the first place? Maybe Val, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm Val Tamer. I'm senior narrative designer at Ubisoft Paris Mobile. I'm currently working on an unannounced project, but we've just released Wild Arena Survivors, a mobile battle arena game with heroes. So that's live and can be played. Yeah, but the other thing I can't say anything about right now. Before I joined Ubisoft, I worked for King, the developers of Candy Crush, where I was narrative designer on several games of the franchise. And I got my start at Daedalic Entertainment in Hamburg, where I was a narrative designer and writer on point-and-click adventure games. For example, Can't Fall, It's the Pillars of the Earth. Yeah, and that was my first full-time job, basically. Would you like us to already say how exactly we got into the industry, or or is that a later
Maybe
question?
just the teaser version, if you'd like.
Yeah, the teaser version is I studied game design at university, and I had an internship at Daedalic, and later, after I finished my degree, they asked me if I wanted to come on board full time. So basically.
Great, thanks you. Thanks. Thank you very much for sharing. That's what I meant to say. James, you want to take over?
Hello, yes, so I'm James. Thanks for having me here. So I work at Fishlabs as a narrative designer. I've been there for about 6 months now. And I haven't worked on the game they last released, which is Chorus, but you should definitely check that out because it's a great game. And before that, I was working at a studio called Wilson. And that's where I got my break into the industry. I had an internship there after completing a master's degree in game design and production. And yeah, I was there for 2 years before I made the switch to Fishlabs. So yeah, 3 years in the industry currently. And I can't talk about what I'm working on at the moment, except that it's really cool. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, you're the cool game guy. Okay, it's noted. Great. Lena, you want to make the circle complete?
I would love to. Thank you for having me, Johannes and GameStarter. This is a lengthy story because I'm a bit older. So I've been in the industry for 10 years and I've worked on Drakensagen Online first, but I've had like a non-digital games career before that with Das Schwarze Auge, the Dark Eye, for 17 years or such. And I am working on games with Paintbucket Games. Paintbucket Games is a Berlin studio, which I am freelancing as a narrative director for. So we did Beholder 3 together, and I'm working on an announced game, which is a rarity, and it is The Darkest File, which is sometimes somewhat of a spiritual follow-up to Through the Darkest of Times. So it's a political game about trying to catch Nazi after the war has ended and not before. So in a young German republic. And I joined the industry basically through my tabletop RPG career and my writing career, because I'm a novelist. Was a novelist before I became a narrative designer. And so that kind of interlinked was a good stepping stone for a writing career in games and then a narrative career in games.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that opens up another question to Val and James. Was your path straightforward into the games industry, or did you have a pre-games life like Lena before that?
It was a little bit twisty and bendy for me. Initially, I planned to go into animation, like animated movies, and actually wanted to start a degree studying for this, like 3D animation. But when I looked at schools, I found that there were like the first game design degrees, and on a whim, and because I like video games, I started studying that. And initially I planned to become a concept artist, but throughout my studies, I realized that I was always the only one caring about the narrative of the game in the group projects. So I was always doing that, and then I accidentally got an internship as a game writer, and then I just kept on going in that direction. And narrative design kind of came from me having an interest in game design and writing, and oftentimes companies, at least the ones that I worked for, not hiring specific narrative designers, but kind of like they want game designers and writers, and somebody has to do the narrative design on either side. And so I usually had to wear several hats. So I always had like a game design / narrative design / game writer path, basically. Yeah.
How was it for you, James?
As for me, I suppose it was kind of weirdly straightforward. Well, not straightforward. I studied English literature at university, my bachelor's degree. And then by my third year, I think I was studying like narrative theory and narratology, and I was playing a lot of games at the time, and I was like, so do people like write the words in these games? Like, is that a job people have? Because I didn't think it at the time. And so from there, I did a bit of just like looking around, and I found a master's degree that was in game design and production. I didn't specialize in like narrative design in that master's, but it gave me a lot of insight into design processes, the production cycle, things like that. And straight out of there, I was like a couple of months out of my master's degree, and I just found an internship for a French studio, Wilson, and I applied for that just on a whim, and they'd accepted me within like 2 weeks, I think. But a lot of it was to do with they were far into the production cycle and needed extra manpower, so they were pretty desperate, I think. But that's how I got in, and then from there, it's just spiraled from there.
And it took you somewhere great, so why not? Thanks for those very interesting answers about your first steps into your career and how you got there, what you're doing now. The next block of questions my colleague Amanda will ask to you. I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce you in the beginning.
No worries. I'm Amanda, and I'm working at Gamecity Hamburg as a project manager. And now in my block of questions, I will go a bit deeper in about your job. So my first question is, if you were asked to describe your job as a narrative designer to your great-grandmother, what would you say? Val, maybe you'd have an answer for that?
Yeah, I can start giving an answer for that. I mean, I was in the situation of having to explain my job to my grandparents several times over and over again. So basically what I do in my job is that I create the narrative experience for the players. So the story experience. That means it's not only about me writing the story and thinking of character backstories and world building, but also thinking about how to deliver that story to the players. So I talk to the artists and the game designers and everyone on the team to make sure that the end result tells a story that basically I have developed with my team together. And it's like but it's focused on the story of the game, using all elements that you can use for storytelling in games.
As for me, it's kind of a difficult one because I don't think I ever talked to my grandparents about about narrative design. But so if I was to, I know that they like to play chess quite a lot, so I'd probably say something like, you know, that game of chess that you love. Imagine if those chess pieces could talk, and when they moved across the board, they said something, or they responded to the move that the other player had made. I basically write what those chess pieces would say. And that's basically how I try and describe it.
Yeah, that's actually a very good description, James. I was saying something in the same lines, though obviously I would need necromancy to talk to my great-grandparents about games, but I think they would have a hard time understanding what games like digital games are about anyway. I would probably say something like, you remember playing like cop and criminal or cop and robber on the streets, and imagine like if in a computer you could basically play like have the other people played by like, you know, painted figures that, and I make those, like I describe those painted figures, something like that. But usually if it's not like starting with Adam and Eve like that, I describe it as basically like narrative design as opposed to game writing is like the world building process, the character building process, the design process to build the characters, building the settings, making sense of everything, because that's initially, at the end of the day, that's what we do as narrative designers. We make sense. We make sure that the game makes sense to the player, because we're kind of the lawyer for everything that the player experiences in the game.
Thank you. The next question is, what does your typical workday look like? Or does such a thing as a typical workday even exist?
Should I start?
Yes,
I'm
please.
a bit out of the ordinary because I work remotely with Paintbucket games, and I work like as a freelancer. So this is not, I don't have usual and typical days, or maybe the typical days would be like we usually meet on Discord and to talk about something, define something, design something. Somebody makes notes so that like we work on Discord and Miro, because after the pandemic, like everybody's used to being in a home office, though we kind of get tired of doing that, like everybody else, I assume. And usually what we do is like I usually talk a lot about metaplot, or about like the perspectives that we use. The metaplot being like not the tiny quest, for example, but what happens in the grand strokes of things. How is the overall plot of the whole game, and then how do we break that into smaller pieces and bits, and how do the characters need to support that? Because we don't design a world from scratch. We use the German Republic after the war, so the baseline is basically already there.
I guess I could pick it up. So for me, because I guess I'm not in a freelance position, I'm in a permanent position at Fishlabs, and we're beholden to producers, so we have Handsoft and a list of tasks that we have to look at, and they force us to look at all the time. And so at the moment, it's kind of interesting, I guess, because we're in a specific phase of development, which is like the research phase. So a typical workday is more about thinking about things that we need to investigate, like is there a mechanic we're working on that delivers narrative in a certain way, and can we pull some inspiration from other sources? Can we innovate on other games in interesting ways? So questions like that. But in terms of like the formal structure of my day, I guess it begins in the morning with like a stand-up where we all get together in the morning for about 15 minutes, and we just sort of talk about what we did yesterday, and what we're planning on doing today. And in that time, we'll probably talk to each other about any sort of blockers that we have, so things that are stopping us from completing our tasks. And usually, you know, we'll talk about whether someone else in the stand-up can help unblock that person. And if that's true, then, you know, we set up other meetings to align and sync on things and make sure that everybody can move their tasks forward. So that's like the beginning of the day, basically. And then I guess I have after that, it's probably a more in-depth discussion with my narrative team, where we talk about our task list and what our priorities are, and whether we need to shift those or whatever. And then when I actually get to sit down and work and write on stuff, it's probably those research tasks I mentioned, or like sitting together with my team in a mirror board and coming up with ideas for characters, where they fit in thematically with the rest of the game, with the meta plot, as Lena was saying. And yeah, I guess that's kind of my typical day.
Yeah, as for me, saying something is a typical day is kind of tough to do, because I feel like depending on the phase of the project and specific daily demands, I have very different responsibilities. Like, for example, there is the pre-production phase where I do a lot of research and writing lore documents that are not meant to be in the game, but more for making creative decisions down the line. And that is like character bios, world building lore, any important like rules of the world, like that kind of lore thing. But then there's also the more narrative system design aspect of it, where I make like PowerPoint presentations about the narrative structure we want to have in the game. Like, how do we want to tell the story? When do things trigger? At what point? Do we have cutscenes or not? Do we have like documents you can find? Dialogues trigger at specific points. Like, creating those systems is like the game design aspect of narrative design. And sometimes I just make PowerPoint presentations and show those to people. So there's like presentations happening all the time too. And there's actually not a lot of writing per se in these phases. There's also the creative direction part that I have to do at some parts, where I'm basically the lore keeper and discuss with other crafts how that lore informs creative decisions on their side. Like, I have meetings with sound designers where I discuss the lore of a certain area to find out what sounds we want to have there. I sometimes give briefings to character designers to find out how a character can express their backstory in their look, or what kind of character we even need in the first place, because I'm like, we need this NPC for this feature and this story element, so now I'm briefing an NPC. And luckily, there's also the writing aspect in itself, where it's about like writing in-game dialogue and creative text, but also functional text, like UI text, or like descriptions of like attacks or items. And these more game designy descriptions are sometimes done in are mostly done in collaboration with game design. So sometimes I receive first versions that I then rewrite. Sometimes they just give me game design documents and then I write something for them. Sometimes it's on their side and I just like revise some things. But it's a lot about like wearing different hats depending on what phase the project is in, and collaborating with the team on many ends.
Thank you. There are probably big differences in writing for different game genres. Should one specialize in on a certain genre, or do you think it's better to be proficient in several different genres? James.
Oh. So it's kind of difficult, I think, to try and specialize in a game genre as a narrative designer, because I guess the first job you get is probably not going to be one you would preferably be in. The game genre you're going to be working in is probably, I mean, if you're like me, it'll be in something that you're not necessarily that familiar with or don't have a specific interest in. But what I would say is that it definitely serves you as a narrative designer to have a broad knowledge of all different game genres, because they all deliver their narrative differently. They use different systems and they use their systems to different degrees of complexity. And it's very important that you are able to pick those apart and understand why they work in that game genre and why they might not work in another game genre. Like a I don't know, like a companion system, for example. In an RPG game, you could get really complex into like how the character feels about you and how that may change how they act further on down the line. But if you're doing an action adventure game, which are generally more linear and there's less scope for branching paths and things like that, where all the characters change their decisions, then that companion system probably just is more of a flavorful thing where, I don't know, the characters are reacting to the stuff you're doing, or in like a game like God of War Ragnarok, annoyingly telling you that this is how you complete the puzzle, even though you could figure it out yourself. But yeah, so that's what I'd say is try and study these as much as possible and get to know them.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Because narrative design is already such an extremely specialized field that like specializing in a specialized field feels like you're just never having another job again. I think you gotta have a little bit of flexibility, and also knowing how narrative is structured in different game genres helps you to make interesting decisions in the genre you're working on at any given time. And even if you're not, if you don't have deep experience in a new like genre that you've been put on, you can do research. And if you have experience working in narrative design, you know how to analyze these genres and understand what makes them unique. So you kind of teach yourself to understand narrative structure along the line, and learning new things about new genres will become easier, even if you have to like read and play a lot of stuff when you start a new project. So I would also be more in favor of a more widespread experience, especially because you can do more interesting recombinations, like taking something from a genre that is usually not associated with what you're doing right now, and then like transferring it over if it works. Yeah.
I would absolutely agree, and add to that of course every person has a favorite genre. Like I know people like a fellow narrative designer at Big Point back in the days, Jessica Del Fanti, loves horror. I don't like horror so much. I'm more of a drama or epos person. And I know like Falco Löffler, for example, who is a very comical person, and he loves to write like funny dialogues. I don't write funny dialogues as well as he does. So everybody has, I think like everybody needs the talent to analyze a genre and find the beats or the Merkmal in Deutsch. What's a Merkmal? The
attribute.
Yeah, the attributes of the genre that make it very much that that genre, that form the genre itself, and then rebuild that. But of course, everybody has their own genre that they love and maybe do specifically well.
James already told us that he's currently researching a lot. Is research an important part of your job too, Val and Lena? Maybe Val can start.
Yes. Absolutely. Research is a super important part of the projects that I've been on. Either about like researching existing lore, like when I worked on the Candy Crush franchise, just diving into that and understanding what I'm even working with, what the tone is, what the characters are. But also researching like real life stuff for inspiration, even if it's not like when you have a historical game, of course, you need to do research, but even if it's just basically loosely based on something, you need to do research. And it's usually about researching media in general of that thematic genre and researching games of that gameplay genre. And yeah, since you end up working on such different games, research is usually one of the first steps to do, because like I haven't been on the same type of game in my career so far. It's just been different genres for every new project.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. Like either it's the game genre or the other games in that area that you need to know about and avoid copying or explicitly go to for copying, like certain mechanics, for example, or plot devices. But also with Dragon's Online, we built a content update that was basically built upon Aztec culture. So you go into museums and stuff and look at research articles about Aztec culture, or at the moment we go into Nazi crimes and research Nazi crimes and how they were prosecuted or if they were prosecuted. So there is usually you need to find a basis for what you're writing or what you basically want to be the plot about or the game about. And on the other hand, if you build a world from scratch, like if you build a fantasy world or a science fiction world that is totally new, you also basically need to know what else is out there, what has been done already, what can I, like, what are the cliches and the stereotypes of the genre that I need to know about and maybe avoid pitfalls or go into a direction that feels is fresh and new. So research is always part of the thing.
James, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think generally as well, it's just like research is just a really good source of inspiration, like reading stories about other people's and that sort of thing. It can just like energize you in the project that maybe you don't have a specific attachment to when you started off. And I think also like as writers, like you're often called on to write characters who are from like a lot of different backgrounds. And as an individual, your like realm of experiences like can be quite limited. It's like if you're writing, you know, characters that are from marginalized demographics or stuff like that, and you're someone like me, like a cis white straight dude, then it probably serves you to do some research on the types of stereotypes that may be harmful within certain demographics, and you know, to bring sensitivity readers on board and stuff like that to show you where you may be falling into some traps that are harmful and things like that. So I think in that respect, research is also quite important as well.
Thank you. How involved in the technical side of development are you, or are you completely separated from that? And how important is an understanding of the technical side? For example, should aspiring narrative designers try to learn a bit about programming? Lena, maybe?
Sorry, audio didn't want to activate. I think if you have a knack for that or an interest in programming, it's absolutely helpful to do that and go there. It is, I think, like in practice in big companies, the two fields are very far apart, like programming on the one hand and narrative design on the other hand. But I always say, like, understanding programming or understanding the engine you're working with is that at least is an absolute must, so that you know you need to know the technical core set that you're wearing to tell a story, because different engines allow you different mechanics, for example, or different ways to express the story or the characters. And yes, absolutely. You need to, so on the developing of the game. So usually, for example, at Paintbucket, we try to find the gameplay together first, because gameplay, like at Paintbucket games, like political games that deal a lot with German history and not always the best history, you absolutely need to find the mechanics first that are interesting on the one hand and do justice to the topics that you do on the other hand. And I wasn't involved in finding those mechanics as much as I would have loved to, but usually you can either add to that, and everybody in the company, because we're not like that big a company, everybody is involved in adding to the gameplay, for example, or in giving feedback. No, this is not fun at all. We need to spice this up, or we need to make this quicker or more interesting or deeper or whatever. So everybody's game experience is basically something of value to the whole company, because in the end, even though it's like a political game with a harsh topic, we want players to have an interesting experience while playing it, and that's basically highly intertwined with the narrative itself.
I would say knowing about game design as a narrative designer is more important than being able to program stuff. Knowing game design is basically essential, because if you don't know about like how to tell the story with the game mechanics and can't have a conversation with game designers, you're a game writer. You're not a narrative designer, really, because it's so deeply intertwined. But regarding knowing programming and being technically involved, I know it really depends on the company and the specific position and how big the projects and teams are. I know that at Ubisoft, some narrative designers implement the narrative that they make. So basically, they have to work in engine and understand how the engine works and put things in there and connect things visually and typing in some things. So they wouldn't like use C# or like a programming language, but they would have to be able to use the like engine in a technical way to implement and then test their stuff. Like right now, I'm also involved with implementing and testing the stuff that I'm writing in engine. So as a narrative designer in some companies, there might be a chance that you have to do the technical stuff as well, but that really, really strongly depends on the company and on the specific job description. And I found that when a company has game writers and narrative designers, the narrative designers are more likely to be more technical.
Oh, I don't really have much to add to all that. I think Val and Lena have pretty much covered it all. I guess to second some things that were said, like for me, from my experience, I don't need to know how to program, but I need to know how to communicate with programmers. It's like it's that point about being a game designer. You need to know, you know, what you want your systems to do, when you want certain things to happen, and why, under what conditions do you want them to happen, and you need to be able to have a conversation with a programmer about that if they've been, say, assigned to creating that feature for you. And you also need to be, you know, be able to understand how to implement those things, and you know, the programmer will help you through all that if you're lucky. But yeah, that's all I've got to say, really.
Now up for one of my favorite questions I'm always asking people. What was your most unusual or surprising task so far? James.
I haven't really got many unusual tasks. I suppose like a strange research task I had once was to study the immune system of the human body. And that ended up with me creating like some sort of mind map about the different immune cells that were at play in the human body, and what different functions they had. And that was helpful to the game designers in some way. So that was quite an unusual one, but nothing really strange, I don't think.
Yeah, for me, it started out as an unusual and surprising task because I didn't know it could be part of my job, but now it's become a regular part of my job, which would be doing voice direction with voice actors. Like first time that happened, it was basically a matter of oh, we have all this text and we have a fully voiced game and we're not gonna hire a voice director. So the writers are just gonna do it. So I basically went to the recording studio in another part of town for 3 weeks instead of coming to the office and learning on the fly how to direct voice actors and tell them, like, that's the character, this is the scene, and this is what I want from you, and oh, another take please, now more sadly, or this and that. And since video game scripts don't necessarily come in a chronological, nice and ordered way, I would also have to be the one giving context. So there would be a line following another line, and they would be at completely different ends of the game, and I would have to know and tell the actors so they don't accidentally create something tonally mismatched. And yeah, at first that was weird and unusual and surprising, but now I'm doing that again this week, and yeah, it's basically become a regular part. And now I know it's actually not that rare for narrative designers and game writers to end up doing just that.
Absolutely, I would agree. So I think my most unusual thing that I did at Big Point while on Drakensang Online was basically scream at a microphone on a very high pitch, because they needed screams and of something like a banshee, I think, and I can scream very high. And doing the oh, when you basically got hit, like a woman gets hit by a sword, or like tries to lunge at somebody with a sword. And you usually distribute those tasks in the team to people who like doing that shit. And a kind of a task that I did once was basically design like 3 or 4 different fantasy languages for different peoples in our game, the dwarves and the Nordic people and the snaky people that live underwater. I took like basically Indonesian and Icelandic and stuff like that, and tried to build a grammar, like a very rudimentary grammar, and a couple of like vocabulary lists and names for that, to have like fantasy audio babble in the background, because we couldn't, we thought about doing that instead of a full voiceover for the game, because that's really like needs to be localized into 20 languages afterwards. So we tried to go for the fantasy language, but it didn't end up in the game. Like that is something that happens to you all the time. Like stuff you do doesn't end up to be in the game, which was kind of sad with this kind of like audio fantasy language. I would have loved to see that.
Thanks. Exciting answers as usual. My last question before I give it over to Johannes is, what makes a good narrative designer? Val?
Yeah, so a good narrative designer combines the skills of storytelling in games specifically. So like being a writer of another medium is only the starting point. Like understanding how to tell stories through games is important, and making use of every aspect of the game and taking this role of lore keeper and mini creative director to not only be the person who delivers words and the rest happens in the other room, but being a core essential part of the team, and infusing narrative into everything that everybody does all the time, and then checking if it works, and making sure that the narrative experience of the player turns out to be what you planned, or what matches the vision of the game. And yeah, combining writer, designer, creative director, collaboration roles together is, I think, what makes a good narrative designer.
I guess I'll go next. It's more of a soft skill, but I think it's really crucial. And I mean, you probably can guess, but like communication. because you're the person who you're obsessed with the meaning making of the game, like what the game means and how everything in it is creating meaning. And oftentimes, like a lot of the people you work with may not even consider that what they're doing is actually creating meaning or telling a story. And it's kind of your job to show them how it is, and then sort of guide them to a place where what they're doing resonates more with the game you're making, the themes and the overall like story you're trying to tell. So yeah, I'd say that's probably a big one, like knowing how to communicate and also being able to present things like to a team, like presenting ideas to a group of people and being good at it, which is quite hard, is really important, because you are the glue and you're trying to bring everybody together, and presenting and explaining your ideas is a crucial part of that. And the other big one is also kind of a softer skill, but it's like being adaptive, because like games development and production is like this really long, winding process, where lots of things get added and cut, sometimes out of nowhere, and usually you have no say in the matter sometimes, and you've got to be able to take those pieces that you're given and kind of mold them into something that still resonates with the themes and the story that you've been working towards. So yeah, being able to work within restrictions is very important. And this is something I think a lot of writers learn. It's a good skill to have. Like I sometimes, to challenge myself, I'll write a poem that has very strict formal requirements, and that's just a good exercise for me. Yeah, being able to work within restrictions is definitely a big one.
Yeah, and since Val and James have like basically left nothing to say for me, I'll add on something that's basically like a good narrative designer is the visionary of what the game is all about, and the story of course, and the narrative is all about, while understanding that it's not your vision alone that's being communicated through the game. So you have to understand art, for example, but you have to leave the artists room to breathe and do their own version of the characters. So it might not be what is in your head, in your vision, but it might be their vision that's much, much better, because they are the experts on art and you are not. You might be able to say, okay, this basically hits the theme or the vision, but maybe it might differ from what you had in mind. So like, and that's kind of like an impossible situation, being the visionary while letting other people doing their magic in the game. So that's basically my take on things.
Yeah, great. That's excellent segue to our next section of our questions, because you already mentioned it. Basically, teamwork makes the dream work, and that's the headline of the next few questions. I'd like to know how closely do you actually work together with other areas and departments in the development process? Maybe Val, you want to start from your current experience?
Yeah, I would say like on a scale from 1 to 10, how closely do you work with each department? I mean, there's like touch points for every department, basically. The game designers, the artists, the sound designers, and usually like in my current project, I work with the game designers most closely. For the others, it's usually like having meetings on a need by basis, basically, but that means it's usually regularly depending on the phase that's currently going on. So yeah, regular meetings with the different craft specialists is basically crucial. And we also have regular like team meetings where basically we present what everyone has been doing during the past sprint, so that everyone is basically aware of what's happening. So that when you realize, oh, this person is working on something that I should like talk with a person about, then you can initiate that at this point. Yeah.
Lena, maybe do you have a different perspective from the freelancer point of view?
How closely do you work with other departments? Like at Paintbucket at the moment, as a freelance narrative director, I don't work with art so much, for example, because we have Sebastian Schulz, who is a fantastic art director, and his team of also very fantastic artists. And they develop the look and feel of the game. I remember with Big Point that was different, because there I was basically the get-to person to communicate like everything from characters, how do they need to look like you need to set up a system, a process for how to communicate that, because like if you have a lot of characters in the game, you need to have, like, for example, an Excel sheet that has art assets for like characters to be clothed in clothing or something like that. So you have to have a system in place, how to communicate and what to use to take, and how, like, what culture this is. And I agree that like regular meetings to communicate that are highly important, like basically with everybody who wants to be part of the narrative, because though a programmer might not actually have a job involved in co-designing the narrative, they might have an interest in doing exactly that. So having meetings for brainstorming, for example, to make the game not only your vision, but actually have the team involved in the vision of the game is highly important. I think James earlier mentioned the need for a lot of communication between, like, you're basically the grease between all the other departments. Sometimes I felt like that at Big Point, right? You basically make everything work in a way so that the end result is a nice one and a pleasant one and fitting your vision. And maybe every department feels like that, by the way. So I had little to do with programming at Big Point, for example, because like usually only when you need basically tools designed or redesigned, or you have like a narrative system that you designed and have to communicate that to a programmer. Like in meetings, you sit with everybody usually. But you talk to QA, for example, because they also need to test your lines, if you have written lines, or they will tell you if like a level that you co-designed makes sense, or if the NPC are standing in the wrong corner and everything looks silly, or has a different context than you intended to. All that can happen. And you talk to, I don't know, you talk a lot to, for example, the community team about stuff to hand out to people to make them curious. Production, of course. So you talk to everybody, and you need to be able to talk to everybody and understand what they are doing and how you can facilitate their work and vice versa.
Well, that's pretty much covered everything, I think. Yeah, what else can I add? No, it's okay. Got nothing else to add, I don't think. That was pretty extensive.
Yeah, well, maybe I just jump in with the next question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think there's always a clear line between a narrative designer and a game designer? For example, when it comes to designing a quest, or how much does it overlap?
yeah, there's a clear line. Like as a narrative designer, I'm interested in the dramatic content of a quest. I'm interested in when dialogues trigger when. I'm interested in how the characters are feeling at certain points in the level, when this changes and things like that. And these things need to be communicated to a level designer because they're also interested in the pacing and the feel of their levels. So you need to be able to communicate these things with them. But ultimately, yeah, you're providing the glue again, the vision for the emotional sort of content of the thing you're making. Like a game designer, in the context of a quest design, they're probably looking at the encounters that are in the level or the quest and trying to balance them and make sure they present enough of a challenge to the player. Also, these challenges aren't overly exhausting for the player or something like that. So yeah, there's a clear line. Also, like game designers are more interested in, I suppose, because they've got a load of systems and mechanics that they want to introduce to the player, and these things need to be introduced at a steady pace. You can't overwhelm them with all the systems at once. So a game designer will often have a vision for when they want certain mechanics to be introduced, and so they'll talk to you about that, and then you'll be like, okay, maybe we can do it in this way where it also hits an emotional beat as well, and you could try and weave those two things together. Say if they want to introduce, I don't know, a new weapon, maybe the player grasps that weapon when they're like on the floor and I don't know, in need of something really quickly, and so you've kind of introduced it in a fun way. But yeah.
Maybe thanks a lot. Maybe, well, from your experience, are there situations or tasks where it's more blurry between those two jobs?
Yeah, I would say game design is basically the craft of creating the player experience, right? And narrative design is creating the narrative player experience. But even if you don't have any words, the game design creates the story. It's basically storytelling through action and interaction and systems. So actually, at Ubisoft and my previous job at King, narrative designers belonged to the game design craft. It was like a specialized version, basically, and that makes sense to me personally. And while and so it makes a lot of sense that game designers and narrative designers work closely together, because narrative design should be in what the player does, because that is the unique thing about the medium that we have, the interactivity, telling a story through action instead of just observation. Yeah. So I would say it's there's actually like a very huge overlap, so much so that narrative design can be counted as the fusion between game writing and game design.
Okay, yeah, great way to put it. And maybe for the role of, I can imagine the role of narrative designers switches a bit or shifts a bit in different types of games. For example, in a very story-heavy game, should the narrative designer be something like the vision keeper for the whole game? What would you say, Lena?
It highly depends, A, on the game, and B, on the size of the company, I'd say, to the previous question, by the way, too. Because in smaller companies, you tend to have like wear many hats as a designer in general, and people are looking for jacks of all trade, basically, that can design systems, can design narrative, and be basically the visionary for the whole thing, or even a creative director type. I'd say that yes, in story-heavy games that have a huge narrative focus, I think that the narrative team or the narrative director or whatever tends to be the champion for how the game should like basically feel, like what the experience is and what fits the experience of the player and what not, more than in, I don't know, games that there's this calling of a narrative wrapper, like a present that you give to people, like you wrap it in shiny paper and you give it out to people, and they think it's nice. So sometimes story is just described as some sort of narrative wrapping paper that is wrapped around the game in itself, or the sometimes even the monetization machine below it. I think that a narrative designer is absolutely the vision keeper for the player experience, because like experiencing the story is basically looking through a different lens than the designer is looking at the game, because they build it up from scratch and the players look at the game from the exact opposite direction. And looking at games like from that, like keeping yourself innocent enough basically to look at the game with a fresh eye, like from a player's perspective, is basically something that the narrative designers need to do, because usually nobody else does it. Unless it's already at the QA department, and then it's basically too late, because they should not, or usually you cannot change that much when it's already in the QA process of a big company. Then you cannot change that much anymore.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I just realized we're already one hour in. It's super interesting. I'll just close up the teamwork bit and hand it over to Amanda again after that. Just one more teamwork question. How big are the teams actually that you work in, and is it a team of narrative designers or a team of that is tasked with narration in general, or are you embedded in a project team, or so to speak? Maybe James, you can shed a light on how it is at Fishlabs at the moment.
Yeah, so for me, I'm in a team of narrative designers, so 3 narrative designers, and we're generally working like together on everything narrative related. But we're not always working on the same things, like especially when you go deep into production and you need to sort of divide and conquer basically, and there may be, you know, different levels being worked on and at the same time, and there are different points in the game. So in these instances, the narrative team may be split into like more project teams. So one team is like a mixture of people from all different disciplines, like art, 3D artists, animators, VFX artists, things like that. And you'll be in a team with them, you know, collaborating on and working on this particular level. But like I'll always have the narrative team to go back to, so where, you know, we can table our, you know, we can collaborate on issues that we have in our project teams, things we're trying to solve, and we can bring those back to the narrative team and discuss them there. So yeah, how big is the actual team? The project team. I think at Fishlabs, the project we're working on is about 50 people. Yeah, but the narrative team is 3, and then I'm working on like a level thing prototype at the moment, and that's about 12 people, I think, but I'm the main narrative designer, who's like the contact on that feature. Yeah.
Well, I guess from your facial expression that it's a bit different for you.
Yes. Well, I'm the only narrative designer in my team. I'm the only narrative designer on. I basically had a freelance writer to help me out for a limited contract to deliver pure game writing. But I'm the only narrative designer on the team, and there's no narrative team that I work with. And it was the same for when I worked at King. I was also the only narrative designer taking care of the projects. I had a team at Daedalic though, with 2 other narrative designers / writers / creative directors.
So the more hats you wear, the more team colleagues
Yeah.
you can have. Great.
Yeah.
Lena, is it any different for you?
Yes, absolutely. So Paintbucket is a very small company. I think we are 20 people, including freelancers. So that is not a lot of people. And like I said, with smaller companies, you tend to wear more hats. So in our team, and like I said, it depends on the kind of game that you're making. If you don't have levels to be designed per se, but quests or screens or whatever, you tend to be a narrative designer and kind of a level or content designer and maybe a game designer. Like we have 1 or 2 people, like our CEO and creative director Jörg Friedrich is basically one of the people who's also heavily involved with the narrative on a day-to-day basis. And then we have Hannah, who's doing narrative and like a lot, like goes into the engine a lot, for example, on a daily basis. And at the moment, a couple of interns who also work their way into the engine. So yeah, but Paintbucket, like I said, we do narrative heavy games, so we tend to have more of that, I think, than like Candy Crush game clones, for example.
Okay, so 3 very different approaches. Great, thank you. I'll hand it over to Amanda for the next section now.
Yeah, the next section is about ideal career starters. My first question is, we did a little Googling and we couldn't find any specific formal education programs for narrative designers for games. So would you say that there's some type of formal education that is necessary or at least helpful for this profession? Well?
Yeah, so personally, I have a bachelor's degree in game design, but it's more game development when you look at what we did. It was like a course that spanned everything from game design to art to the working in the engine, a little bit of programming, a little bit of narrative design, and I found that very useful because it gave me a basis to effectively understand development and communicate with all the different team members, even though the big chunk of actually understanding my craft did not come from this education. And I know that other narrative designers come from very different walks of life, but they usually have, usually not always, have a degree related to media and creative writing or writing. So it can be anything from like theatrical studies to journalism or creative writing or English or filmmaking. And I think that is like a path that people take. But I've also seen people who have a formal education that is completely different, but they have had some work experience in that general writing and media and game direction.
Lena, could you add to that?
Very gladly. So I would actually say that a journalist or a screenwriter make a better narrative designer than a novelist. I am a novelist, so I know what I'm speaking of. So like in journalism and in screenwriting, you learn to like strategically condense your narrative to what's absolutely necessary for the story or the narrative that you're writing. And if you then go the next step and play a lot and like gobble up everything that you understand with regard to movies, dramaturgy, theater, novels, etc., and understand how to tell stories, you're basically on a good way. I also would say that there are a lot of good educations, like Val mentioned, that usually focus on game design. Or game development as a whole, like the University of Europe for Applied Sciences that I'm teaching at is basically like we have two, with me and Chonga Baranyai, we have two professors who are very experienced in writing or narrative design for games. And you can absolutely learn a lot, I think. But like me, I've studied English and German and written novels, and then came into the business sideways as a narrative designer through playing a lot of games and trying to make them. And that's also a very valid way into the industry, I think. Though I think you can make, like, this is probably the hardest way, because you have to be an autodidact to teach everything to yourself, and that's not necessary and not a good way for everybody.
Yeah, I think for my experience, like I had a formal education in English literature, and then I went on to do a master's degree in it's games design, production, and enterprise. So it was like a three-pronged master's, and I didn't really, similar to Val, I guess, I didn't learn much about the actual craft of game design and narrative design from that course, but I did learn some very valuable things about what it means to collaborate and work in a team, what the different phases of development are, and the different challenges they pose to you. Also, just like dealing with stakeholders was a big part of that course, and it's a skill for a narrative designer to have, I think, to be able to convince like stakeholders that what you want to do is actually the right path forward, because they have a lot of their own ideas. So that was quite valuable. The course I'm talking about is it's at Birmingham City University, if anybody's curious about it. So it was helpful to me in certain respects. But yeah, I think there are plenty of other valid ways of getting into the industry and learning your craft that Lena and Val have outlined. They have a lot more insight into that on me, so I'll stop right there.
So what would you say are the hard skills a career starter should have before starting, Lena?
Hard skills in narrative design before you start. You should love stories. That's a soft skill. I'm sorry. You should have written stuff, actually written stuff. It doesn't matter what, actually, like like if you have learned to condense what you want to say into articles, or if you want to have understood how to tell a story in an audiobook, or if you have tried out branching narratives with Inklewriter, or I forgot the second engine that I usually mention at this point.
Twine, maybe?
Twine, yes, Twine 2. Thank you, Val. You know what I'm speaking of. Right, Twine 2, for example, is an excellent and easy to understand engine to actually try yourself out in narrative. So, soak up everything you can get your hands on with regards to dramaturgy, for example, and understand the strategic points of storytelling. That's basically my advice. And of course, like if you're actually being hired in a bigger company, you might want to understand like what is the tool that you're working with. So is it Artisy Draft? Is it I don't know, Fungus by Unity? Is it, or with Unity? Are they working in Unreal? So understand how to get words into the machine. That usually helps a lot. But sometimes the companies actually accept that you learn that on the job, when they're basically looking for somebody who's just a good storyteller, and who understands exactly the kind of level of storytelling that they want to convey with a game. Then they might take you even if you don't understand the engine that you should be working in, I think. So that's from my side. Maybe, I don't know, Val has something else to add to that.
I mean, what you said is correct. It's kind of tough to pin down hard skills for narrative design, especially because I found that being able to work in a specific engine or with a specific software is rarely a prerequisite for a job. You usually get to learn it while you do it, because sometimes it switches from project to project. Like the same company doesn't always use the same engine. But I think you should have used a 3D engine in your life so that you basically understand how they function, like roughly. You don't have to be like you don't have to have like amazing games that you made all on your own, but you need to have an understanding how these game engines work in general. Then understanding interactive storytelling, even though it's not always going to be a part of your writing, basically, with like story branches and interactive dialogues where characters react to what you say. That's not always going to be part of your project, but it's still an important like base skill to have. And also being able to write dramatically, like for movies, but also being able to write effectively for the technical bits of games. I'm thinking item descriptions that can't be longer than 50 characters or even shorter. Barks for characters that are these like super short things that characters say during gameplay, like what Lena talked about before, like little when they're hit, or something like watch it grenade, or silly like things like that, what games are full of usually. And like writing these sparks, these super short narrative bits that are highly contextual and depend on what happens in the game, super short descriptions, also UI text, just getting information clearly to the player, ideally with the vibe of the game, so it still has the same tone, but not but clarity is more important than tone usually. And yeah, knowing how to write both dramatically and do world building and think of cool characters and express their personality in dialogue and all that, but also the I don't want to say boring, because these like very restrictive tasks can also be a lot of fun, but the things that are usually forgotten about, that are almost invisible, but those are also important things to understand and train, and also things you can put in your portfolio, basically.
Yeah. Yes to all of that, basically. I don't think I have anything else to add, actually.
James, then you can have my next one. What about soft skills? What else do you deem essential?
Oh, I suppose I've already talked about these soft skills, but yeah, communication, being able to communicate your vision to a team and steer people to towards decisions which are more thematically resonant, and also being able to, as Lena said when I said that part earlier, to be able to listen to other people and follow their trails of inspiration as well, and see where it takes you. Don't become a tyrant, because I feel like we as narrative designers, we know how important we are, but I think sometimes we need to realize that we're not the directors most of the time. Yeah, and then the point about working within restrictions I said before. Yeah, being able to adapt to production pressures and things that come down the pipeline. So just reiterating what I said before, basically.
I would add something very important to that. Like, I agree to everything James just said, but I would add that taking criticism well is absolutely a required soft skill for a narrative designer. I mean, for everybody in a game company, actually, but like being able to have your work criticized and changed due to production changes, for example. Val knows what I'm talking about here. Frustratingly reworking your work due to production changes, for example, or even like taking feedback and implementing it without taking it personally is absolutely a soft skill you need.
I mean, I don't really have much to add since Lena and James already said the most important things.
So one last question in my blog. Did you or do you hold personal responsibilities? And if so, what else would you look for when screening applications or having interviews with potential new junior colleagues? Val?
You mean personal responsibility for like a junior employee, or
Yes,
yeah,
process.
yeah. Yes, I was involved in like picking applicants for the freelance gig for helping me out. So while we did the screening, we basically had some like example like writing tests that were like sent over to check if that person can write in the kind of style that we want. And yeah, we basically just asked, hey, have you have something that fits this and that kind of tone? And then the freelancer sent something over and we read it. And I think we then also devised an additional test that tests more specifically if it would work. And in that case, it was kind of a mix between past experiences, because that was like a repeated freelancer who's already worked with some people from the team. So we knew that this was a person who's like reliable and friendly and good to work with, and also whether the style matched, basically, and whether there were like the base skills, the base experience that we expect that we need in this project.
Lena, can you add anything to that?
I would agree first, because as like Val, I've also picked like freelancers and dealt out tasks to outsourcing people. I think that the being good to work with and being able to like understand the story and safeguard the story and make it logical, have it make sense is kind of the skills that I would be working towards. I'm sorry, yeah, and so that's my take on things.
Yeah, so we recently hired a junior narrative designer at Fishlabs, and during the interview especially, one thing that I was looking for, and which we found obviously, is basically this: you need to be able to like tell me why you've made the decisions you make in your storytelling and why you make those decisions. Is that there are so many different like analytical tools out there for analyzing story structure and dramaturgy and all these things, but knowing what your particular, I guess, like lens is, your angle, and being able to demonstrate to me how you've used those analytical tools to develop your own writing is really great to see, because it shows that you're thinking critically about your work, and and that you can explain to others why something works, basically. Because we all have things that we like and we sort of know intuitively that worked for us or something. But being able to like say why, this worked, why that monologue in Andor worked really well, is a very important skill, I think, and it's something that I definitely appreciate in an interview.
Thank you. I give it over to Johannes. The next questions.
Yeah, great. I saw we already have a lot of questions from the chat, and I swear we're gonna get to them real soon. But first, I've got a few more questions that are more practical tips for career starters or people who might start their career in narrative design. So first one would be, based on your own experience, is there a common mistake or misconception about narrative design as a career and as a role that you often encounter in career starters, or is there something that you yourself would have wanted to know before starting your career in narrative design? Maybe Val?
Yeah, I think the most common misconceptions is conflating narrative designers with game writers and thinking the term can be used interchangeable, which is not true. Like, as a game writer, you only focus on drama, dialogue, in-game texts, but you're not as collaborative as a narrative designer. A narrative designer is basically helping to tell the story with all the aspects of the game, being in touch with the artists, the game designers, and the rest of the team. And also thinking of the narrative systems. When do we trigger what? What is the framework of delivery, basically? So it's kind of like game writers or authors, and narrative designers also have to make the book from scratch first. Yeah, that's probably the most common misconception, which also comes from some companies using the terms interchangeably and not differentiating them perfectly in their job description. So it's important to read the job description and be aware of whether the job is more of a game writer, more of a narrative designer, or even a technical narrative designer, where you're not even expected to do any writing for in-game, but it's only about the game systems and only about implementation. So yeah, read your job descriptions well, I guess, and your portfolio should cater to the type of narrative expert that they're looking for.
So James, do you have anything to add about common misconceptions or things you would
I mean,
like to know?
my answer is going to be pretty much the same as Val's. Like this idea that narrative design is just about, I guess, sitting in the corner and writing nice dialogues and characters and stuff. You definitely need to know game design principles, and you need to know the how and why of the narrative delivery in your game. Yeah, everything Val said.
Lena, how about you?
Yes, and I would add to that, despite all of that being true, that like narrative design is not about words first. It's about words last, because usually you are the go-to person to find all the mistakes, like being it grammar mistakes or interpunctuation or how to spell words, because like if your company is a good company, you have somebody who corrects your spelling and your text, and that is how it should be. Like nobody, I know one person in the world, a dear friend of mine, who's actually able to write dialogue that's printable from scratch. But it's not very dynamic. But it's like flawless dialogue, and nobody else besides Oliver writes like flawless dialogue from scratch or on the first throw. And so you need to be aware that you need to know your spelling and your grammar and all that, because it's highly unlikely that anybody else in the company knows it better than you do, unfortunately.
Okay, that was some great insights on what you should know before you start applying or start even looking for jobs. So let's say you're one step further. You decided, I want to be a narrative designer. And do you have any tips for applications from career starters or even people who are still students? Is sending a portfolio customary? And so, if so, what would it look like? What would it contain? Maybe Lena, you want to answer that?
Yeah, so I've applied for several positions, and usually you apply with writing that you hand in, like something that highlights how you write dialogue, how you write interactive narrative, if you want to hand in twine story, or just how you, I don't know, like I've sent, like at some point I had a short story that I've written, translated into English and polished, like I translated it into English myself and had it polished, to be able to hand it in to like to show people like what my style is, for example. And you can do that. You can do all of the above. And the second step usually is, and I think that's actually a good idea, that you get handed a writing task. You can, I think with many narrative applications, you get handed a writing task that then asks of you in a certain time frame to describe characters or to write a dialogue to a specific situation with specific strategic needs, for example. Not defining, like you cannot be certain if in the dialogue they're talking about a male or a female person, because the character might be adaptive, like a player might have generated a woman or a man, or I don't know, non-binary even, and stuff like that. So my tip is usually, or my counsel is usually, to keep it cool and try to get everything done that you get handed, because sometimes you cannot make all of that in a given time frame. Yeah, having stuff ready that you can just send out is actually a very good idea, because then, yeah, like you can shoot it out when you see a job description, and do stuff that you feel comfortable with and that you love, that you have loved writing maybe, or designing.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing is, portfolios for narrative design jobs are, I feel, just as important as for artist jobs. So you should like work on a portfolio, and you can also try to adjust your portfolio depending on what kind of job you apply to. Like if you see that it's if you already know that it's going to be for a company that makes comedic projects, show them that you can do comedy. If it's more drama, then show them that you can do drama. So a portfolio should basically be like this big thing that you curate for different jobs, and things I would put in there are basically it can be anything from like short stories that you've written, dialogues. Dialogues are always a very good idea, because games are rarely going to be written like short stories, but more like dialogues and screenplay. You can put in some interactive fiction, like made in Twine or Inkle Writer, where you can show that you can do interactive stuff, if that's relevant. And also like the short stuff, like short item descriptions, short barks, short character bios. Yeah, just put everything in there that you can get together for like a fictional, non-existent game, something you've perhaps done during your studies, like a student project, or wherever you, whatever the context is. And also what I experienced is that even though there's a portfolio usually involved in the application, companies are very likely going to send you tests nevertheless. So basically you send the portfolio first, and then they're going to give you a test if you're like in the second round, basically, and you get a specific time frame to complete that test. And that test usually contains something like write a dialogue, write write a quest, like what does the what does the player have to do, how do they get there, what's the goal, and so on and so forth. So like quest writing can be in there, item writing, blah, blah, anything that is in games basically. And yeah, but creating and curating your own portfolio is usually always necessary for applying for narrative design jobs.
Yeah, all I would add to that is even if like you find that the stuff on your portfolio that you've created doesn't match maybe the genre or style of writing that the company you're applying for has, that shouldn't dissuade you like necessarily. I think you still collate your best stuff and send it to them, because usually if they like your writing, they will the test will usually tell them if you can write in their style or not, and that's usually what will happen. So yeah, that's all I'll add.
Great, thanks. Some very valuable tips from you three. To end off this block, I think there will be in the audience questions some more about exactly those things. But one last question from me on my list. Is there anything else you would absolutely like to tell our audience about this career path as a narrative designer? Anything that you always wanted to say about narrative design as a job?
I have something that is very important. Guys, you think it's easy. It's not. Like, narrative design is not the easy part of game design. It's complex and it's unnerving and it's can absolutely drive you crazy. But I sometimes see people or students who think like that's the easy way into games. And like being good at narrative design is usually something that that comes with I don't know, a lot of experience and pain. Sometimes it comes with pain, let's face it, let's put it like that. So I would advise you to like bite into it and really try to understand what it's about, because it's not just words strung together or I don't know, a copy of the Lord of the Rings strategically, but yeah, it's more than that. I'm sorry.
I guess I'd just say, like, as writers and narrative designers, please like look out for each other, because this the career path can be quite not brutal, but there's a lot of external forces trying to stop your progress as a narrative designer. And so looking out for each other's narrative designers and just like creating communities where you can talk about, you know, your applications and your portfolios and issues you're having at, you know, jobs you've started, how to, and, you know, having people you can go to talk about how to deal with a certain situation is crucial, I think, just for your mental well-being going forward in the industry. So yeah, do that as well.
Yeah, what I'd like to add on what Lena has said, narrative design as a craft in games feels kind of like being in the Wild West, where it's a lot of learning by doing, and there isn't a lot of written down knowledge how things actually work well, which is also why it's a like chronically underestimated craft, I feel. Because everybody thinks like, oh, we're gonna make an awesome game and you will think of a fun story that we put on top, and that's not the job, and that's like not even beginning to describe all the things that belong to this job. So like you can expect to do a lot of like personal like learning and trying to innovate on things that nobody really wrote down anything about, trying to find solutions that are not easily discoverable, just trying to make sense of things about trial and error, and then having your features be cut first, because basically narrative is often, at least from like the higher ups, considered to be the set dressing, the cute colors on top. So anything that is heavily narrative is very likely to be cut down first. And that is like a frustration you have to come to expect. Basically, like some companies are very narrative driven, and it's in their company philosophy. And there are also projects that have that as like their core pillar, but a lot of projects are gonna treat narrative design and story as the funny thing on the side that we don't necessarily need for a great game.
Okay, thank you very much for those very honest perspectives and honest words on narrative design. I think Amanda has a few last things.
Yeah, are there any open positions in the narrative design department at your companies right now, especially for interns or entry-level employees?
At Fishlabs, sadly, not for any entry-level positions because we just filled one, but there are senior-level positions available. That's all I have to say.
I think that Paintbucket usually is worth applying at when you're trying to get an internship that fits their portfolio, doing like art programming or, I don't know, narrative or game design of political games. They might not take you because they get like several applications, but it's worthwhile trying anyway. And yeah, they might not have like open positions and or announce them on the website, but at many like of smaller companies, it might be worthwhile trying to send a spec application and offering what you might be able to do for them.
Yeah, at my studio, Ubisoft Paris Mobile, there's no open position for narrative designers or game writers on any seniority level right now. But Ubisoft has studios all across the world, basically, and there's like tons of open positions at all times. And you can just check the website under careers, and it lists all the open positions. But I'd also like to add that, as Lena said, it's probably worth it to think about applying for smaller companies for your very first job as well. Possibly in your own country, locally, maybe even, if that's possible. Because the bigger and the more AAA the company, the more senior they likely want their applicants, especially when they come from overseas or like from another country.
Thank you so much. One last question before I get over to the questions from the chat, which is a personal one. Is there a person or a team whose narrative design you particularly admire? James, maybe?
So the game, I guess, that really inspired me to get into narrative design was Hellblade by Ninja Theory. I just really appreciated the research that went into that, and that's something I really admired about them, is the lengths they went to understand their subject matter and have it portrayed authentically in their game, and that's something I seek to replicate in the projects that I work on as well.
Yeah, I love what Neil Druckmann did with The Last of Us and The Last of Us 2, because he took a AA, AAA game and made it highly political. And he got threatened with death threats for that, which is kind of absurd. So I think I would count him among my narrative design heroes.
Basically, I can just think of a bunch of games that I thought were really cool narratively. Way back when I like started to be really interested in the narrative of games, I guess would be the Silent Hill games, especially Silent Hill 4. Don't ask me why Silent Hill 4. I know it's not the most popular ones, other ones, but it really struck me as extremely intriguing and layered, and the environment was telling a story, the items were telling a story, what you did was telling a story, and the narrative was oozing from everything in the game. There was not a single thing that was like just there for gameplay, basically. But for more modern examples, Disco Elysium, for the extremely complex narrative system that they created, where basically there's so much player choice that you forge the character's personality through your actions, almost like you're a baby learning to become a person through your actions. And that is super intriguing and complex and has lots of replay value in a meaningful way. And I also really like the fairly new Guardians of the Galaxy game because it had a really interesting team relationship systems where you really felt like you were part of that team, and they accompany you during the mission. You have gameplay interaction with them and banter at the same time. It just felt very alive and gave you that teamwork and found family experience that I really appreciated.
Okay, now I try to squeeze in the questions from the chat. The first one is, what are some of the problems you often run into as a narrative designer, and how do you deal with them? Lena, maybe, because you talked, you warned people a bit about difficulties.
Problems during narrative. So repetitiveness is a problem that usually comes along with game engines, like that you have to squeeze your narrative into quest types, for example, that feel repetitive unless you are very, very careful, like a kill quest, a collect quest, like accompanying quest. I forgot the specific term for that just now. So
escort mission.
Thank you, Val. Yeah, COVID did stuff to my brain. I'm sorry. Escort missions, everybody hates them, everybody does them. That is one of the aspects, and the other aspect is basically that don't stretch what, like, look at the ways, like at the engine, and try to find out what ways it offers for you to tell the narrative and the story. Don't stretch it too far. Like, don't overdo it with a complex epos if it's not, like, if the engine doesn't allow for you to tell that story. It will feel forced and strange, and you will always be frustrated. And yes, I did it at some point. And try to really find out on what level the story is that you can tell with an engine, because with a Candy Crush game, again, you will not be able to tell a Lord of the Rings story, for example.
To kind of build on top of that a little bit, one big challenge is also to know where to put detail and complexity and where to keep things simpler, because you can, for example, decide to write 50 individual randomized lines for an NPC because they are your companion and they're always right next to you, and that makes sense. But if they're just a random person that you walk past maybe 3 or 4 times in the entire game, that's wasted work time, basically. And anticipating the level of detail needed for each aspect of the game is kind of like you're trying to be a clairvoyant. Basically, because the game isn't even finished when you start thinking about these things. So the game designers are still figuring out how the game works. The level designers are still building the map, and everyone's still crafting the anticipated golden path of the player, and also anticipated alternative paths. And with so many different player types, the more freedom you give them, the more varied the experience can be. And you have to anticipate how different the experience will be narratively, depending on where you put what kind of detail. And doing that guesswork ahead of time is really important to, in the end, have a good experience for the most amount of players. Because imagine you put like a really awesome story in a side quest, and then neglect the main story quest that everybody plays. And you're like, well, the best part of the game wasn't seen by anyone, so that's an unfair review. So yeah, you just have to anticipate varying levels of detail needed for how players will actually interact with your game.
I guess a slightly different problem I would talk about is knowing what to do with people's feedback, I suppose. Often, like as a narrative designer, you'll be presenting things to a lot of people, to the team more broadly, and you should welcome feedback because feedback is valuable. But often a lot of people, most people, think that story is quite easy. Like we're all like kind of natural storytellers to some extent, and everybody has an opinion on what stories work and what they like and things like that. And so in these situations, you can get bogged down in talking about all the different feedback that people have given you and like trying to rebut them or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And it ends up being this whole squirrely mess where you're not really sure why you started the discussion in the first place. So in these situations, when you like present something and you're getting feedback, like what I usually do is like provide channels for people to provide feedback, but make it clear that it's not going to be a protracted discussion. You're the narrative designer, so you're going to take all that feedback on board and you're going to assess it through the lens of like the game you're trying to make, like the themes and the meta, the story you're gonna yeah, analyze that feedback through the lens of what you're trying to do, and then yeah, you're the one making the decisions about the narrative. So yeah, just be careful about the way you handle feedback, I suppose.
I have another question. There's someone asking how realistic the chances are to get into narrative design or game writing if they already work in a game studio, but in a completely different role, as an example, a programmer.
Why should you? So if you're actually getting the salary of a programmer, you don't want to go back to getting the salary of a narrative designer. But anyhow, it might happen if you want it. Talk to your producer. If you're like working in a different capacity in a game company, you have basically done the first step. You've proven that you can actually do games. So if you want to change your portfolio, you might actually talk about, I don't know, like Fortbildungen, trainings in a different direction, and or work alongside your narrative designer for a while, for example, to learn the ropes. And then it might happen, but be aware, if you're a programmer, they might have a hard time letting you go into a different direction because they need you badly.
Paul or James, anything to add to that?
I mean, I can basically confirm that this is like an option when you already have a job in a studio. I guess when you are working in a bigger studio, you can just tell your manager or producer that you want to have trainings or study under a more experienced narrative designer, and kind of have that like on the side while you continue your job, so that you at one point maybe can switch over if there are capacities and the need for it, because they're probably not gonna just change your job description if they don't actually need a narrative designer at this point. But it's always like an option to ask. And if you work in a smaller indie company, it might be that you just need to express your interest, and you can just do that at the same time as you do your other job. Basically, just starting out as like a support narrative designer, and then seeing how much responsibility you can take over in that project.
I've got nothing else to add.
Then there is one last one asking about if it's different to create a narrative for a small project or a bigger project.
I'd say yes, very different. There are a lot in a bigger productions. There's a lot more dependencies. There's a lot more moving parts, and you need to be aware of all those moving parts in order to make the thing you're making. Yeah, maybe the other two have more insight into this.
I would say that designing a narrative or the basis, like a starting draft for a narrative, I have a feeling it always takes 3 weeks. Not depending if it's a big one or a small one. If it's a short story or a novel series, usually you need a certain amount of time to flesh out like the grand strokes, and then you have something to build on and can move apart from that, away from that. But as James said, basically, it very much depends on, do you already have an existing game and are fleshing out additional story to that? Like how much narrative is actually needed for the project? Is it a narrative heavy or a narrative light game? Yeah, Val, please.
Yeah. Well, I would say that the smaller the project, the more responsibility you have to shoulder alone. But that also means that usually you have less budget to work with, and often less time, and less complexity that you can get. So if you work on like super huge AAA action adventure open world games, you're likely going to have a team and not only be by yourself. So that completely changes the work environment, I would say. There is likely going to be more specialized narrative craftsmen and craftswomen, that they're like technical narrative designers and game writers and narrative director. And suddenly there's a whole narrative system that has to kind of work together, while this huge monster of a project kind of has to be infused with narrative, and it's gonna be basically impossible to do all that by on your own. And that is the biggest change, I think. But the basic understanding, the basic what is narrative design is like not gonna change. Just how much time, how many people, how complex, how much budget, that will influence how your day-to-day work will feel.
Thank you. Then there's one last question from me. James, you said earlier that you should connect and take care of each other as narrative designers. Do you know any resources where you can actually do that, or where like game starters or like people that are new in the industry could connect and find their way into narrative design?
I'd say Twitter, but it seems to be capitulating. Like add us 3 on Twitter or LinkedIn, for example, and maybe we can point towards some Discord channels where narrative designers are gathering and talk to each other. because they do exist. So yeah, reach out to specific narrative designers and try and find out the specific like Discord channels that you can join. I think would be a good course of action.
Well, Lena, do you know any resources such as Discord channels as an example?
I mean, I would have said the same thing with like Twitter and Discord channels, and also perhaps local events. Sometimes there are like meetups, game design, like game development meetups locally, which can help to forge connections around the corner.
Yeah, go to business fairs, go to meetups, go to game jams, for example. You might meet people. So building a network is always a good idea. Way before you actually need it. So if you go into building a network or into a game development meetup, when you need a job, it might actually be a little too late, and you might have a phase where you have to basically deal with needing to set your network up. But yeah, like James said, Discord channels, going to fairs and like talking to people at parties always helps. Actually helps. Like being in the industry and being a presence in the industry, like trying to get to know the right people. But that's true for every business, basically, like trying to be part of your industry and make yourself a name.
Thank you so much. I had and also the chat had a fantastic time with you, and I'll now give the mic to Johannes to say the last words.
Yeah, thanks a lot, you three, from me too. We've been talking for over 2 hours now. Thank you for sharing so much knowledge and bearing with us a bit longer than planned. It was great, and it was so many insights. Really great. Thank you very much. A few last words to the audience. So if you'd like to be informed about the next Gamestarter event, which we haven't planned yet, to be honest, but we will, it's a regular series, you can subscribe to our newsletter. Just go to gamecity-hamburg.de and you'll find the newsletter at the bottom. And if you'd like to have an insight into other roles in the games industry, just browse our YouTube channel. You'll find all the other editions of Gamestarter there. Also, as a starting point, you are very welcome to join our Discord server. You'll find a link on our website as well. There's over 1,000 people from Hamburg's games industry, as well as all over the globe on it. And it's a great start to make connections and to dive into the industry. Yeah, and thanks everyone for watching. And thanks to Val, James, and Lena for sharing so much of your knowledge. It was great and a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so then it's time to say goodbye. See you next time.